Welcome to another episode of On Production. Today we're fortunate to have Aaron Gordon, the executive producer and founder of Optic Sky Productions, with us. Optic Sky is doing some truly innovative work in the realm of production, VR, AR, motion graphics, and 3D digital assets. Let's dive in. Aaron, how are you, man?
I'm awesome, man. How you doing?
I'm doing great. It's really nice to have you on production to share a bit about your journey and kind of how you are thinking about production as it's evolving very, very quickly. To start, could you share a bit about your professional journey and what led to founding Optic Sky Productions?
I can. Yeah. I right after college, I did a stint in features as a DIT, and I'd always loved commercials. I'd really at the time wanted to move more into shooting, but I just kind of was always the guy that kind of made it happen. Just to make it happen type of guy. And so I was in all these features. I was DIT. You get as a DIT the craziest requests because you're the guy at the computer all day while everyone else is like burning like a billion calories. And we kind of had moved into, I brought a couple friends on because they wanted on-set edits. They wanted, a lot of grading. And weirdly enough, we kind of almost started in editing features and doing post on features from there on the indie scene. But I had always loved commercials, and I had mostly been in New York City for a lot of these features. I'd gone back to Western New York. And luckily, because of a mentor of mine who was a professor at RT when I was there, he was kind of in retirement, and he started to just randomly say, "Hey, if I could pass you a couple of clients, like, would you be down?" And I was like, "Sure," not really knowing at all what that entailed, but he did, and gave us some really cool kind of regional opportunities. But very quickly, what became apparent to me as I then, of course, did my due diligence and started researching all of like Western New York region and kind of beyond was, in New York State, outside of New York City, there was no larger form production companies. There was no one kind of pushing the edge here. And it was a pretty insular region where a lot of the agencies here weren't really kind of going out to a lot of the larger production companies outside the region. So I kind of had this moment where I was like, I really want to do commercials. I'm doing a lot of features. We have a little bit of revenue coming in because of post on features. Could we really make a stink here? And more than anything, could we kind of push what I felt like was the region was a little bit stuck in the 90s. And I was like, could we push it to some modern, creative quality? And that's what we set out to do. And kind of very quickly, we got there faster than we thought. And then, one day I turned to the team and I was like, okay, guys, national time. Like, how do we, make a much larger national image? But by the time we had done that, what's really cool about how we had evolved and kind of always learning as we go, this was around the time when a lot of new technologies were coming out. So we were like, let's hit the national scene, but we always were a big fan of R&D, kind of pushing the edge, trying new things. And so we had really kind of gotten into our hands into really random stuff through experiential. And we really were pursuing at that point, augmented reality and virtual reality. We kind of formalized it. We were like, well, let's actually make this an offering. And then as things have evolved, a lot of those technologies formed around the same tech stack. So we had already put all the money and the effort into diving into that. And so while we're doing production, while we've gotten, really into the national scene, doing larger, awesome scripted productions, we got heavily involved in AR, VR, and then all of a sudden, kind of the newest evolution of virtual production comes along. And so we really dove really quickly into virtual production because it uses Unreal Engine, the same as we were using for augmented reality and virtual reality. And that really kind of solidified our journey into what we are now, which is a company that pursues any type of motion, while I think bringing to a lot of our partners and a lot of our clients this kind of thought process of like, well, most 3D digital assets are transferable. So if you're doing a production with some sort of virtual background, are you using that real estate on your digital experiences? Are you using that real estate here, using it here? Because it has never been more transferable than it is today. And so people are really able to scale creative in a very different way than they have before. So that's kind of what brought us to where we are today.
That's super fascinating. I mean, so, it sounded like you had this on-set experience of dealing with large, tranches of data that turned kind of your interest into kind of classic post-production services, but it's really evolved. I mean, how long have you been in this business yourself? And then how long has Optic Sky been around?
Yeah, so I really started freelancing even when I was a student in college. But Optic Sky itself as a company has been around for 9 years. I've been doing it over a decade.
How have you seen, what are the biggest changes you've seen in the last 9 years in terms of kind of your production operation from like practical work moving into this really like digital space? Like, I'm very curious, like how it's evolving in terms of your clients and then what you're also delivering at the end of the day.
It's a great question, and it's almost a loaded one because I think it depends upon what angle we take it from. And I always will indulge any of the angles. I think there's kind of three facets of how it's evolved in the way I look at it. The creative asks have evolved. I think you get a lot of people who say like, oh, productions are getting smaller, or like people, don't want as much traditional production. And I'd say that's totally not true. I think production is very alive and well. And I think that it's evolved in a really, really killer way actually recently, but a lot of the classic venues for it have changed. At the same time though, what I've found is, we had started at the time when broadcast buys were really kind of shifting into taking online seriously.
Hey, Aaron, I mean, that's super awesome, your background, coming from production, building a production company, and really kind of going on this journey from practical production to now, where it's evolving so quickly between Web3 and AR and VR and digital experiences and metaverses. I'm curious, can you walk us through a typical production process at Optic Sky? Like, what do you believe sets your production work apart from others in the industry?
It's a great question. I'm trying to figure out the best way to answer it because I almost can take very little credit for this. So our head of production, Matt O'Neill, he's a total sharpshooter. And I think one thing that he helped us realize several years back was project management across any medium is something that we actually see as a weakness in production most of the time. I think we take it for granted that production's managed well, but we're an industry that works a lot like construction. You have a firm bid, an upfront budget. Your success is defined by, did you make the building that you set out to make? Did it look good? But also, did you come under budget, and did you make sure there's no injuries along the way, right? And so for us, when we started moving into other mediums, we realized that that has to translate across other projects. We need the project managed in a way. So actually what we did was he had the whole team train up on traditional project management and some non-traditional project management. And part of our process, having come from kind of making it up as we went at the beginning of the stages, right? And not necessarily saying like from day one, being young kids, we weren't like, oh, we know AICP. We really grew into that. And we really grew into the national scene and doing the $1 million productions and doing, the $500,000 productions that somehow are the same size as the $1 million productions, right? And what we really found was managing client expectations by being a true partner and getting them what they actually want is kind of what actually sets us apart. And the way I say that is for a reason. I think some people will argue, oh, clients never know what they want. I'm like, no, clients know exactly what they want. Most of the time, they're really good at knowing what they want, and they're at least good at knowing what they're tasked with. But production, like construction, is such a huge undertaking that what they don't have time for is to worry about all the minutiae of how to get there. And I think that, a lot of people think that they can pride themselves on being a little bit like shepherding clients through and doing that. But I think there is a nuance to it that we figured out a long time ago, which was if you really treat it like traditional project management, it's not about trying to overly please a client for what you think they want. It's about really setting up great expectations up front and setting what the key performance metrics are of the project so that you can actually give them what they really do want. And a good example of this, like kind of a contrast I can give is we've got into some like traditional agency bids. And the agency's prerogative is to make it awesome creative. But what we're hearing in the calls is like, well, the client wants to do this, the client wants to do that. Like, it's going to be okay. Like, we'll figure it out. And we're going like, well, our assumption is you want to make this amazing. Our assumption is the client wants something amazing. But what we're hearing in the call is that you're kind of willing to settle. And we need to have this conversation up front of what are the non-negotiables, what are the settling points, and what are the points that need to be amazing. We want it to be totally amazing. We also understand that your budget just got slashed in half, for example. So let's, as partners, have the creative conversation. What's going to change on the creative? to make what we actually, execute on amazing. And it sounds so simple. And a lot of companies go like, oh yeah, obviously, like that's what you do. But I think a lot of people somewhere in that process kind of back down in a weird way, or they shut down and they don't aggressively have those conversations up front. And then what ends up happening is every step of the way during pre-production, there's this dilution that goes on. And so I think, all that to be said, we try to make sure it's run really well. So A, we come out with an amazing creative, but B, it's something that we know and can put our signature on, even though we don't do the media buy, it's going to get results based on what the actual media ask is. And C, we treat our vendors really, really well. And the only way to do all three of those things is to project manage the absolute heck out of a project and to have a scalable solution. And I think this is where, like, even the tech stack makes a big difference. Like, right, like shameless plug to Wrapbook, but a lot of people want to have this amazing production management system across all their productions, across all their deliverables, but they're hiring producers freelance that have different processes. And, unless you have that book and that Bible of this is exactly how we need every production to be run, and here's what we lay down. And a lot of those are very executional. Most of the companies like, the Smugglers of the world and other major companies have long since established, those processes, and we followed in their footsteps. A lot of mid-sized to smaller production companies don't go through the process because they think they have to have 3 offices or a global presence to get to that point. And my argument is that you don't. If you start from that standpoint, from everything to how you manage the clients, how you hire, how you, structure the PO to what your tech stack is, then you'll actually scale faster. And then one day you're going to look back and be like, thankfully we did that. And so I think that's one thing. And I think the other thing too is because we've put so much time, effort, and money into new technologies and new types of work, we have a lot of opportunity to say, hey, this is amazing. We noticed that you're also doing this across these mediums. We can be a partner in that too. And maybe not this project, but next project, think of us. And so we become for clients a little bit more than just a singular vendor for a singular purpose. And I think that helps a lot. And, agencies appreciate that. Clients appreciate that alike. It's been pretty good for us.
That's awesome, Aaron. I mean, so it's not just kind of classic production operations. Like, it sounds like you've built the foundation from kind of classic commercial production work, but now you are repositioning, or you're positioning your business to really be a production company focused on motion around 3D digital assets, VR, AR. Can you kind of like help us understand how you have dived headfirst into this world and what influenced the decision and how this is playing into your overall production strategy at Optic Sky?
Yeah, it's really funny. Like, I think, it's just a nerd, like I'll just be the first, I'm just a total nerd, man. Yeah, like I just love this stuff. But I originally, when I first went to college back in the day for film school, I came there to be an animator, and I always had a sick love for animation. But my best friend, who we're still best friends and still actually work together all the time, which is great. Was in love with the camera, and so I actually fell in love with the camera because we wanted to collaborate all the time. And so how we fell into these technologies was originally like we were doing post, we were doing animation, we were doing live action production. And someone told me, they were like, hey, have you seen this VR short? And like, this is going to be really cool. And at the time, I mean, if you think about like 4 or 5 years ago, VR kind of had this like moment where people were like, wait a minute, like this is going to be the next thing again. Like it's kind of had those moments for the last 30 years, but off and on. But it kind of had this like resurgence again, where I think clients are trying to find different ways to do experiences. And this is pre-COVID, so hygiene wasn't as much of an issue of wearing a headset in public, right? So a lot of these like public experiential things were kind of moving into this VR space. And so we were like, well, let's dive more into VR. Like that was our thing. Like we can create narratives in VR. We can have directors work with us to create some dope narratives. We can do some cool experiential stuff. And, our 3D animators could in our roster of extension could all participate in creating assets for that. And that kind of set the stage for like where we are today. Like all the way back then was like, we were like, they can create assets for that. And it felt like it was not a whole new offering. It was like an extension of an offering with a little bit of a new kick, right?
What were your first projects in kind of building these sort of stories in these virtual worlds?
Well, that's the funny part is like you dive into something thinking you're going to walk out with what you expect to walk out with, but we kind of didn't. We immediately hired because of our great relationship with our IT in Rochester, and just the amazing talent that comes out of there. We immediately hired two incredible artists out of there that were both kind of a film. They had this amazing VR film as their thesis, and we were like, we're going to create narrative, but our clientele is commercial, right? And so, at first I was like, this will just be kind of like an R&D budget, and we'll just do that. But what ended up happening was we had clients asking, what's the utility of this? And so we actually ended up starting to create utilitarian uses for it. So instead of creating the shorts, we actually were like, well, what if it was this, or what if it was that? Like, what if you could create experience that achieved this and achieved that? And so we ended up creating like a lot of like use cases for VR that actually were more applicable to clients because it was something that was actually usable. It wasn't just like, well, that's cool, someone's going to watch that and then they're done with it. It was like, hey, like this is how you can train someone to do this like in a totally new way, or this is how you can do this like really fun experience, but actually what they're getting out of it is this educational value here. And so some of those first projects were like everything from like training modules that were like really gamified, almost like, like DDR style types of training for like really cool physical things that people need to do, to we created for like some museums, some like interactive, instead of like totally VR, we created some at first VR based interactive exhibits, like for dinosaurs and like other cool things. And then that actually kind of moved quickly into kind of where we led AR and then kind of virtual production and some of those other offerings, which was, wait a minute, COVID hit, no one wants to touch someone else's anything. Can you create touchless interactions? Can you create interactions that, use the same engine, all these assets that we're creating? And can you do something that's in front of somebody, but they don't have to physically touch it? And that's when we really pushed AR hard. And that's when we pushed, I think, some of, using aspects of VR in, more like projection or LED and all those types of things. So it was kind of like a weird but a long journey that like took us from point A to B.
You've mentioned a few times like the power of creating these digital assets for your clients and those being able to be deployed and utilized in all different types of mediums, whether that's AR, VR, classic distribution models. I'm curious, have you all been thinking about Web3 and digital ownership? I'm curious how that's kind of playing into your work, if at all.
Yeah, it's a great question. We have, and in fact, it's funny, we got into, even before it's called Web3, like we got into blockchain technology in like 2017. I mean, we had so many direct tech clients at the time. We were at every blockchain conference you could imagine. And I remember, I tell this story all the time, if you want to set the scene for like what blockchain was for people in 2017. Like, I was at this conference one time, this guy gets up and to start the whole conference, he was like, hey, everyone, welcome to the conference. Like, here's our first panel today. Just to start it off, here's the first question. Like, I think we can all agree in here when it's like 2050 and like half of our governments have collapsed because they aren't the strongest economy anymore because it's global decentralized economies, that this and this and this can happen. And I just remember being there and be like, what is even happening right now? Can you like take a step back? Did this guy just say like, governments are going to collapse because of decentralized, of currency? And, the scene was wild back then, but the technology behind the scene, and how it's kind of translated to Web3 here with the ownership thing was always to make sure that it was super transparent and that, the Walmart case study is my favorite, where it used to take them 3 hours to up to a day to figure out where a food contamination is. Actually using blockchain technology takes them 3 minutes to figure out where a food contamination in their supply chain is, right? So it's an amazingly fast and transparent technology, which is awesome. And so people then started to talk about ownership of digital assets because of how good this technology was, right? Here's the problem and why we haven't as a company made an offering that gets us into it as much as just keep our eye on it. The problem is that if you're an original content company and you want to capitalize on that, you need to keep your eye not only on the content that you're creating, but on the technology, because every other day, a platform that was considered safe and a platform that is trying to hold your interest and rights in something fails. And then all of that's gone despite whose interest it is. And another platform opens up. And our whole thing was for it to be an offering for us, because we work with clients and we're not just an original content company that just distributes ourselves. We have to be able to recommend it to a client with pure confidence and liability and everything that like, yeah, we're going to create this thing. You guys are going to own this among these platforms and no one's going to be able to mess with your usage. And then the next day that platform is not going to crumble. And I think we're at a very unstable time still with Web3. And you see a lot of brands that are investing heavy amounts of money into Web3 real estate and all these other things. And I think it's amazing and they should be doing that. But if you ask any of them, it's still R&D. It's not, like minus live concerts and like some experiential events where they're really making money off of it. Most of this is like a very small R&D budget for them because they're still testing it out. However, what we have invested in is the concept that is behind Web3, which is that, to your point, like what is the glue that brings all these things together? 3D digital assets. And we're happy to create that for other people and let them do the R&D on like what the usage is of that to make sure that they're successfully R&Ding and like, getting into the space. But we're not at the moment going, hey, here's the route you should take to create this, and this. We don't want to define that for them because I think for every brand, we're seeing publicly that some brands are tanking that effort and some brands are doing it and they're killing it, right? And for us, we want to be able to guarantee results if we're saying with confidence that we're going to do this for you and this is how it's going to work.
That makes a lot of sense. So, Aaron, we've spoken very broadly about kind of classic production, the evolution of kind of practical productions into this kind of new digital world that we're going into. Could you tell us about one of your favorite projects you've worked on at Optic Sky and what makes it stand out for you?
In traditional production, one comes to mind still to date because it's before what we would do today. If we were to do, it was the Wegmans Meals To Go project. It was called Lunar, and it was when they just first had introduced their Meals To Go offering. And the reason we loved it was a funny comedy spot. It was great. It was, the idea behind it was an astronaut, like, totally like perfectly replica lands on the moon with like the classic lunar lander. And then it just like reveals that there's just like an alien in front of him. And then it turns out all he was doing was just delivering his Wegmans Meals To Go to him. And they know each other. And like, it was just a fun spot, right? Classic like comedy dialogue. But what I loved about the spot was we practically recreated the moon. We did 5,000 square feet of moon surface. We recreated to a accurate percentage of scale the lunar lander. We used the same suit Ryan Gosling was in for his classic movie for of first landing on the moon, and like we got to do the whole thing, and we did very little post. We had blocked out the whole studio around it, and all we did was just add a little atmosphere and a little earth, and we even literally, like I said, I'm a nerd. Even down to like the gaffer did the calculations of like point lighting from a sun, right? Like we did like everything to try to make it, as accurate within a small studio as you could, right? But what I love about that project today is that I can think of 7 different ways we could have executed on that project now. And I don't know if I would have done it differently, but I love that then there was only one way to do this. That made sense for the budget. Today, for that same budget, we could have done 3 different bids and we could have thought of 3 different ways. And each one has advantages. We could have done it in virtual production. We could have done it, in a giant LED studio. We could have done it the way we did it, where we blacked out the whole studio and created the whole surface and did a little bit of post. We could have done it where we were able to kind of green screen comp it and actually see a few things and pick different sections to kind of comp out. But either way, the project had such good vibes, right? And what we ended up having to do to tackle that project to quality was pretty wild within the budget. And so I love that. That's like one of my favorite projects. Another one that comes to mind for traditional production shows is called Fruit in the Bottom, but the idea, the agency's idea was just awesome. It was Fruit on the Bottom yogurt, but they wanted to kind of do fake out commercials. It's like a fake fashion commercial. So they actually created bejeweled, like fruit on the bottom, like fruit bejeweled patches for jeans on the butt. And it was just like the whole commercial, you're thinking you're watching the most ridiculous fashion ad, and it just turns out it's like a total bait and switch. So those are probably my 2 favorites there. And then I think probably on the digital side, I think one of my favorite projects to date was for this band JoyWave, who are good friends of ours. We did the first ever augmented reality song drop in an interactive way. So like you get these all the time now, but we actually did, we created this like, it's called JoyWave Radio, and you could actually tune, it was like an AR filter on social, deployed on social, and you could actually tune the radio. And not only did we drop, this is when, Meta had really kind of first done Spark AR, you could tune the radio. There's 12 minutes of original content on there. So they actually re-recorded the previous song they had dropped in like a totally different, like fun way. They had a talk show station that had 4 minutes of like talk show that was just making fun of themselves basically. And then they had the new song drop. And so people had to like tune it, like use the filter. And then they realized when they tuned it that they didn't recognize the song. And then they realized it was a song drop. And it was very on brand for the band because they're very, very cool, fun and meta. But I think that was my favorite one still today because they just were so cool about how they went about the content.
That's super awesome. I mean, I'm really curious on your thoughts, Aaron, of like the Meta Quest, Apple's new Vision Pro, how these types of experiences you think are going to augment or change our kind of practical production, advertising in these spaces. Something that I just love about, as an aside before, giving you space to answer that question, like something I just love about our industry is like, I feel like it's finally happening where the very best of technology is really starting to integrate with production. Like I think production has always been a technology. It always has been. It's always been its own kind of corner of the technology landscape versus like Silicon Valley. But like it really is starting to come together. And you're seeing this from Amazon and Apple doing production work, but then also building these incredible hardware experiences. And it's all starting to just blend. So curious how you all at Optic Sky are thinking about these experiences. And I'm also really curious if, from there you could kind of share your vision of what Optic Sky is becoming and how you kind of plan to utilize your digital asset creation and services across these different platforms.
Wow. Yeah. What a great question. I could talk all day about this, just FYI. So I will try to keep it brief because I probably talked for 2 days with friends after the Apple release. We've been looking forward to this for a long time. Being in the AR space, we are pre-devs for a lot of companies, so we kind of knew what was coming. And here's what I'll say about production kind of coming together with these worlds. Everything that we do comes back to what the audience feels. And today, the audience interacts with content in such a different way. It used to be that I still love watching trailers before movies at the theater, and I still go to the theater. But a lot of people have dope home entertainment systems now, and they're at home, and the way they watch trailers is they go to YouTube, they go to IMDb, and they watch the trailers there because they don't need to watch ads or trailers when they're, at their TV. A lot of those same people are now using, what they call second screen, where they're interacting with their phone based on the content they're watching on the TV, to your point about really production kind of moving and merging technologies. All that to say, whether you're on your phone and you're interacting with an AR filter or a technology, whether you're in a headset, whether you're at your home theater or you're at the actual theater, our whole positioning at Optic Sky has been and is embrace what's changed to do what hasn't. And people want to feel something. They just want to walk away moved. They want to feel something. They want to either laugh hysterically, they want to shed a really dramatic tear, or they want to, they just want to get amped up, right? And so I'm with you. I love how productions, I think, really kind of merging and embracing technology. What's really happening, in my opinion, is that creation is getting merged. Not just production, right? But like creation of content is getting merged. So we create a commercial. They go, cool. When that commercial's running, we have the tech stack now so that we can actually buzz someone's phone for the deal that we're advertising on that. We know that they're on our email list and their text list, and that's going to lead into this cool interactive thing that they do. And if they do, they win the competition, then they get this. Like, people are finding a way to gamify life right now. And I think whereas creating video content is a passive experience, you can still really evoke emotion. Everything else right now is a very active experience. And so where I think all this is going with Apple's announcement, with some of the Quest improvements and, where AR is going is, I think it's going to take longer than we think for people to get past watching the idea of a screen. Even if you look at Apple's interface for their new goggles, it's like that you still have squares. The interface is still squares all around you in front of you, because we're not embracing yet the idea that like I can walk around 3D content and I'm watching a 3D object. I want to watch a screen, but within a 3D space, right? And I want to watch many of them. And I want to be able to move them around and do all that. So we're not past that age yet, but we are in the generation that I think that is literally kids right now, by the time they're grown up, is going to embrace 3D space in general. And what we have to be ready for when it comes to embracing 3D space is that the way they visualize data, content, everything is going to be wildly different. And why I keep talking about 3D assets across multiple channels is that I think today, until Apple's goggles are this form factor, there's still an escapism. Do I want to, I already hate being in front of my laptop all day, like doing Zoom calls and typing. I love walking and being on calls much more than being on that. Do I want to have a 4 or 5 pound goggle on my head and literally be worried about tripping over something that's in front of me, because I'm stuck even in that? Maybe the interface is so good that it's useful, but when it comes to like entertainment and content and merging that with production technology, what I think we're entering the day and age of is, how do I make my content so relevant on a passive way that people will be willing to watch it in a 3D space? And then what extension of that content am I creating that they can interact with that makes them want to actually engage with it past that? And I think that everyone's coming to a similar conclusion of how that's going to work. I don't think anyone's nailed it yet. And I think in the next 5 years or so, we're going to see someone kind of nail it. And I want to say it's going to be Apple, but there's a little ways that we have to go, I think, before that totally nails it. And I know this is like a long answer, but if I could summarize like all of my thoughts with today versus tomorrow and like one thought. Today, we're using technology to evolve how we create passive content and merge it with active content. Tomorrow, we're going to be everything is going to be active content and engagement that we can truly interact with in a 3D space. And it's going to be in a form factor that like we can't even fathom right now, or we can fathom, but definitely is nowhere near there yet. And so any production company that thinks that 5 years from now, someone's just going to be watching an ad on our television and that's it, and that's enough to get someone to take a buying action, they're totally going to be lost in 5 years. But people that are embracing some of the newer technologies to go, hey, we know enough about this to know that maybe while you're running this campaign that we're doing, this might be happening, those people are going to be along with the curve. And those that are understanding, when you are in a VR space and you walk around an object, that object can interact with you, and that object in and of itself is its own real estate ad, those people are going to be ahead of the curve in 5 years, I think. And so that's kind of where we're taking it. And I think that's where I think a lot of people are going to be going.
Aaron, super helpful. As we wrap up our conversation, I want to ask for your advice, which is, we have listeners out there who are passionate about production. They are so brilliant and they're able to bring crazy ideas to life on screen. For folks that are really curious in the production world of digging into VR, AR, motion graphics, 3D digital assets, based on your experience and journey, like what advice would you give them? Where should folks be focusing on learning, and what kind of mindset should they have as they navigate this like very emergent and very fascinating sort of next wave of production?
It's a great question. Take what I say with a grain of salt, because everyone's going to find their own path. I sure found my own path, despite different pieces of advice. But if I had to give any sort of thought starter, maybe, rather than advice, it would be acquire talent and treat them well that have a diverse perspective on this, that aren't just another production person trying to get into it. Like, acquire the talent that like knows this world first. Our biggest strength as production people is to tell a narrative. And at the end of the day, every single thing that we create tells a story, whether it's an AR filter, VR, even if it's a training engagement, you're still trying to evoke emotion and tell a story. So I think anyone should be using our strength as production people, as storytellers, to merge ourselves with people that are maybe technologically a little bit more geared towards some of these newer deliverables. And that way it's a win-win. We're helping them understand how to tell a story, and they're helping us understand how to embrace technology. And I think as long as that we can do that, we're going to keep making people truly feel something. And we're really going to actually like touch them, not just kind of force technology on them. And the other thing that I would say is anyone who's afraid of, on the other hand of what you asked, if people are afraid of this, just ask yourself the last time you shot something on green screen and was that there when you first started? Because green screen wasn't, we take it for granted now. It's everywhere. But what green screen changed for visual effects, we didn't have this all that long ago, right? And so, it seems so scary today, but tomorrow it's going to seem so normal and it's going to be everywhere. And so, if for anyone that's afraid to embrace some of these new things, just find someone who's not afraid, because they're probably afraid to touch production. And, as long as it's a mutually beneficial relationship, just find people that take you out of your comfort zone. That's what I feel like do every day. Just find people that know way better than I do on things. And I'm like, it's scary.
That's so awesome. So I'm actually kicking off a new tradition to end these on production podcasts, which is I want to ask guests, who is it that in their career in production really helped them out a lot? For me in my journey in production, I have found that I became a better producer and a better creator of stories based off of just amazing people around me, project after project. So I'm curious, and I'm sure that there's a number of people, but what's just one person that had an incredible influence on your career as a producer and storyteller?
Oh man, that's a great question. I'm trying to think of just one. There are so many people that have affected me positively in my career. Like I take so little credit for the amount that I know today, because it's like usually somebody else told me this. Uh, Oof. Okay, if I'm being honest with you, our head of production, Matt, he not only makes me a better person, and is a dear friend, but going all the way back to what we talked about earlier, I think from the how to make an amazing production standpoint, he changed my whole life. From a storytelling standpoint, I would say probably Sullivan, who was one of the first directors we worked a lot with. He really saw, I think, stories and things that are so mundane and was like, oh my God, there's a whole narrative here, But I think, today I have a whole new set of people, that's the classics, right? But today I have a whole new set of people. I mean, my partners over at Synapse as well, the new virtual production company that we're opening out in LA, some of those guys are vets, and I've been around much longer than I have. And those guys are pushing me in ways that I've never, it's hard to limit the list down to one person, but man, I'll give you a whole Bible worth of them,
That's awesome, Aaron. Well, thank you so much for being on production and sharing a bit of your story. Really appreciate the time.
Oh my gosh, I appreciate it as well. Thank you for having me.